Hello all, this is Chartered Accountant Aumkar Gadgil. We have made this video in respect to discuss the change in effective rate of tax and the practical dealing thereof with respect to the business. Now, in the recent, the 47th GST Council meeting, there were a few rate of changes which were recommended by the GST Council. And on the basis of the same, on 13th of July 2022, we also had a series of rate of tax notifications which were also issued. In order to understand as to how this rate of change in effective rate of tax, one probably is a case where we are going to more deal with is where in case of the hospitals which are having beds other than the ICU, but where the amount of the room rent exceeds rupees 5,000 other than for ICU, now there is a new imposition of tax at the rate of 5% and that too without any input tax credit. On the other hand, we have the changes which were brought in, specifically the levy which has been introduced with respect to the, or we can say the exemption being withdrawn in case of the accommodation stay facilities where the per day charges were less than rupees or up to rupees 1,000. So these two will be considered as the new levies, or where we can possibly say that currently there was 0% rate of tax and now there will be a specific percentage of tax which will be made applicable. Likewise, in other cases also, in certain goods, the rate of tax has been increased from 5% to 18% or 5% to 12%. And as we all know that in the large scenario, the change in rate of tax in case of goods has been made in order to have an intention of, reducing the issues which are cropping up on account of the accumulated input tax credit due to the inverted duty structure. And therefore, in the from 18th of July, especially the date which has been given as the effective date for change in the rate of tax, the 18th of July will be the date. From 18th of July, since the rate of tax or the new rate of tax will be made applicable, we will be having certain ongoing transactions which are currently also having certain aspects which have already been undertaken. For example, we may be having a booking which is already done. We may be having a scenario of advances which are already received, or which may we may be having a scenario where the receipts are issued for the transactions which are yet to take place. So in order to understand that in such case, how exactly the time of supply will be determined, basis which we will be able to identify whether the old rate of tax will be applicable or the new rate of tax will be applicable. So our basis of understanding over here is that we are going to look into this section 14 of the CGST Act, which deals with the change in effective rate of tax and the implication thereof. Now, if you can see, we have two possible verticals over here. One is that supply has taken place before the change, or the supply of goods and services has taken place after the change. Over here, when we say the change, it means the change in effective rate of tax. Now, since the effective date for making this new rate of tax applicable is 18th of July 2022. So we are going to deal with this scenario right now as if the in first scenario we'll understand if the supply of goods or services is taking place before 18th of July, and if the supply of goods or services is taking after 18th of July, then how the time of supply and the date of payments are going to be determined and the rate of tax will be determined in lines of section 14 of the CGST Act. We'll try to understand the same. Now first we'll take up this vertical. If the supply takes place of goods or services before 18th of July, that means before the change in effective rate of tax, our supply, that means the taxable event has already taken place before the change in effective rate of tax. So let's see the first one. Invoice has been issued prior to the invoice has been issued before the change, that is prior to the change means invoice is issued before 18th of July. So I'm now going to keep one base constant that the change in effective rate of tax date is 18 July and my supply has already taken place before 18th of July, means my taxable event has already taken place before 18th of July. In the light of this background, we will see if the invoice has been issued before the change in effective rate of tax, the payment has been received after the change in effective rate of tax. So now what has happened? My taxable event took place before the change in effective rate of tax, as well as my invoice was issued before change in effective rate of tax, but only my payment is going to be received after the change in effective rate of tax. In such case, my date of invoice will be considered as the time of supply. And since my date of invoice is the time of supply, and since it is appearing before the change in effective rate of tax, my old rate of tax, whichever is there currently applicable, will be considered to be applicable for this transaction. So if my supply has taken place before 18 July, my invoice was issued before 18th of July, only my payment is going to be received after 18th of July. My old rate of tax will be applicable. That is, the date of invoice will be considered as time of supply, and old existing rate of tax will be applicable on such transaction. Now we'll go to the next one. If the invoice has been issued after the change in effective rate of tax, if the payment has been received before change in rate of tax, and my supply has also happened before the change in effective rate of tax, then the date of receipt of payment will be considered as my time of supply. And since that exists before 18th of July, before change in effective rate of tax, my old rate of tax will be applicable in such case as well. The third scenario, if the invoice has been issued after the change in effective rate of tax, the payment has also been received after the change in effective rate of tax, only my supply took place before the change in effective rate of tax, then the time of supply provision in such case for the change in effective rate of tax is date of invoice or date of payment, whichever is earlier. So for instance, let us assume over here that supply took place on 16th of July. Rate of tax changed on 18th of July. Invoice was issued on 20th of July. Payment has been received on 25th of July. Then date of invoice or date of payment, whichever is earlier. So date of invoice, that is 20th of July, will be the time of supply in such case. Since 20th of July is after the change in effective rate of tax, my new rate of tax will be applicable in this case. So one vertical that we have right now seen is that one common point that was there, that rate of tax change hone se pehle my supply has already taken place. And in that, two variables possibly means the invoice dates and payments date, basis which we have determined whether the old rate of tax will be applicable or the new rate of tax will be applicable. If the variable which we are selecting as the time of supply is before the change, then the old and existing rate will be applicable. If the time of supply is being selected, which is a variable after the change in effective rate of tax, then the new rate of tax shall be applicable. On the other side, if we see the second vertical, if the supply of goods or services has been made after the change in effective rate of tax, means now we are seeing that 18th July my rate of tax changes. If my actual taxable event takes place 18th July or after that, and the other two variables, that is invoice and payments, are going to vary here and there, in such case what will be the time of supply? Now we are going to understand that. If the invoice has been issued before the change in effective rate of tax, that is before 18th of July invoice was issued, because invoice can be issued before or at the time of supply, so it is allowed as per the provisions of invoicing also. So if the invoice has been issued before the change in effective rate of tax, the payment has been received after the change in effective rate of tax, then the time of supply for the purpose of this transaction will be considered as the date of payment. Means what? 18 जुलाई के बाद मेरा सप्लाई हुआ है, my invoice was issued before the change in the rate of tax, that is before 18th of July, but my payment has been received after the change in effective rate of tax. Means after the change in effective rate of tax, my supply as well as my payment have been done. So in such case, my date of payment is considered to be the time of supply. Now since the date of payment is appearing after the change, in this case the new rate of tax will be made applicable. Now next, if we see, if the invoice has been issued after the change in effective rate of tax, but the payment was received before the change in effective rate of tax, the time of supply as per this provision, and obviously because my supply is happening after the change in effective rate of tax, my time of supply over here will be the date of invoice. And because of the date of invoice being after the change in effective rate of tax, my new rate of tax will be applicable. And the last variable in this, if the invoice has been issued before change in effective rate of tax, if the payment was also received before the change in effective rate of tax, only my supply has taken place after the change in effective rate of tax, then the date of invoice or the date of payment, whichever is earlier, will be considered as the time of supply. Now please remember, if in this case, since the time of supply is appearing before the change in effective rate of tax, my old and existing rate will be made applicable. That is, whichever rate is applicable today will be made applicable to such transaction. Now what you are supposed to do is, in this particular transaction sets, wherever your ongoing transactions are falling in, basis the scenario, you are supposed to select the time of supply. And once the time of supply is determined, you need to check whether it is before the change or after the change. If your time of supply is appearing before the change, you have to make the old rate of tax applicable. If your time of supply appears after the change, then the new rate of tax will be made applicable. I hope this is clear. Now we'll just move for a couple of illustrations. So we are saying that if ABC hotels provide services to Mr. A, where the charges per room per unit are less than rupees 1000. So this is a new levy which is going to come into force from 18th of July. Till now there was an exemption. So now there's a withdrawal of exemption in this case. Now the rate, so we are saying that the current rate of tax is 0%, and now there is a rate of tax of 12% which will be made applicable on this transaction with effect from 18th of July. Now, first we'll say if the service has been provided prior to the change in effective rate of tax. Over here, the date it should the date it should have been effectively the 18th of July. Over here, if the service has been provided before 18th of July, and if the service has been provided after 18th of July, so we'll just try to analyze in this regard. So if the services are being provided before the change in effective rate of tax, that means my supply transaction has been completed before the change in effective rate of tax. And if in such case my variables with respect to the transaction, so what are the variables with respect to the transaction? That is my invoice date and the payment date. So my stay, let's say, was already done prior to 18th of July. My invoice was issued before 18th of July, but my payment has been made after 18th of July. In such case, the date of invoice will be considered as time of supply, and therefore the old rate 0% will be made to applicable to this transaction. If my stay was before 18th of July, my invoice was issued after 18th of July, but my payment was also received before 18th of July. Again, the rate of tax applicable will be the existing old rate, that is 0%. If the invoice is issued after 18th of July, if the payment is also made after 18th of July, just my stay was before 18th of July, this is slightly hypothetical, practically may not be really too much into implication. In such case, because the date of invoice or date of payment, whichever is earlier, will be considered as time of supply, so the new rate of 12% will be made applicable. On the other hand, services if was to be provided after 18, means if my stay is going to be there after 18th of July, but invoice is issued before the change, payment is received after the change, then over here the date of payment will be considered as time of supply. So my date of payment is appearing after the change, so the new rate of tax will be made applicable. That means over here the GST will be applicable. Second, if my invoice is issued after the change, but my payment was already received in advance before the change, but because this is a specific scenario under section 14, date of invoice will be considered as the time of supply over here, since the service is also provided after the change. So supply is taking place after the change, invoice is after the change, only payment was received before the change, means before the introduction of this 12% tax. So in this case, again the new rate of tax will be made applicable, that is 12%. And if the invoice is issued before the change, if the payment is also received before the change, just my stay is going to happen after the change. In such case, there will be no GST made applicable, because the date of invoice or date of payment, whichever is earlier, will be made applicable in such case. That means the old and existing rate will have to be made applicable. That means there will be no GST, since it was considered to be 0% as an effective rate of tax because of the exemption which was prevalent at that particular point in time. Likewise, if you are saying that there is a, now the hospital admissions particularly, what, let me just get into conformity with this. The the provision over here which has been made applicable is that if the room rent of a hospital stay exceeds rupees 5000 per day, and this is not applicable for ICU and any other emergency ICU or ICC or NICUs, etc. If a normal room rent of a hospital is in excess of rupees 5000, then there is a GST levy which has been brought into force. In such case also, on the lines of the similar discussion that we had, we have to be making this tax applicable. Now obviously when it comes to the hospital, every day the payments are made, every day the updated bills and updated advance money is being given, so it will have to be understood in that particular context. Only the thing is that just in the lines of this example, now as much as we just wish to state over here that the rate of tax which has been made is 5% in such case, so that will be made applicable over here. I believe that the rate of tax which has been illustratively mentioned, but we have to take it as 5%. On the similar lines as we saw the analysis of the hotel, same way will be made applicable over here as well. All the supplies of goods as well as services which are going to be having a change with effect from 18th of July are going to be going through the same transition. To whomsoever the rate of tax change is going to be made applicable, we have tried to analyze this on the basis of the provisions of section 14. The provisions of section 14 are to be made applicable. The provisions of section 14 of CGST Act specifically have been made applicable in such case whenever there is a change in effective rate of tax. As we understand that where there was no levy or there was a full exemption, we can say that it was a 0% rate of tax applicable, but still the time of supply will be determined in such particular case, and basis which your rate of tax either old or new will be made applicable. So we wish to conclude our discussion in this regard. I also would like to acknowledge the efforts of my colleague C. Ankita, who has helped me to prepare this transitionary slides for you. So wish you all the best for determining the time of supply of your transactions. Feel free to reach us for any queries. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye bye.